Thank you, David. Overstart. It's about that time. Serve.
Okay, this is my notes.
Oh yeah, do we have to turn this on?
All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. This is Love Bank Books presents award-winning author Garth Greenwell. Greenwell is an alumnus of Washington University of St. Louis, and we are thrilled to welcome him back to St. Louis tonight to discuss his highly anticipated new novel, Small Rain. Greenwell will discuss and sign this profound and luminous novel. Tonight, he will be in conversation with the incredible friend of mine, Dana Levin, distinguished writer in residence at Maryville University. A little bit about tonight's book. No, a little bit about tonight. I want to thank you all so much for supporting Left Bank Books. When you buy books from Left Bank Books, when you support local community-based stores, your money goes directly back into the community at an incredibly higher rate. So I want to thank all of you for supporting Left Bank Books, for coming out to this event tonight. When you buy books, it helps us be able to produce these incredible events, and I want to thank you because that is my job. So thank you for helping me do my job well. And your tax dollars also go back into the community to help keep our libraries free, our parks free, our streets paved, and other incredible boring things. So thank you all so much for helping us here at Left Bank Books present this event. About tonight's event, Small Rain. A medical crisis brings one man close to death, and to love, art, and beauty, in a profound and luminous novel by award-winning author Garth Greenwell. Miranda July, the author of All Fours, says, I just didn't put it down. Very romantic, incredibly moving. And Phil Cly, the author of Missionaries, says, Small Rain is a marvel, one of America's greatest writers working at the top of his game, moving into new territory with force and grace and wisdom and overwhelming beauty. This is the cat ornament. Our speakers tonight. I would like to introduce our conversation partner first, Dana Levin. Dana's newest book of poetry is Now Do You Know Where You Are, named a Best of 2022 book by NPR. Her first book, In the Surgical Theater, was chosen by Louise Glick. I always get this wrong years later. For the 1999 APR Honickman First Book Prize, and went on to receive numerous honors, including the 2003 PEN Osterweil Award. Copper Canyon Press brought out her second book, Wedding Day, in 2005, and in 2011, Sky Burial, which the New Yorker called utterly her own and utterly riveting. And our guest of honor tonight, Garth Greenwell. Garth Greenwell is the author of What Belongs to You, which won the British Book Award for Debut of the Year, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and was a finalist for 6 other awards, including the PEN Faulkner Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. A New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, it was named a Best Book of 2016 by over 50 publications in 9 countries, and is being translated into a dozen languages. His fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, A Public Space, and Vice, and he has written criticism for The New Yorker, The London Review of Books, and The New York Times Book Review, among others, and he lives in Iowa City. Without further ado, would you please help me in welcoming our incredible guests for the evening.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk to Garth about this book. We both brought fans, which was not planned. We encourage you to bring back fans because they are really amazing. And I'm looking at my phone because my questions are here. So Shane gave you a brief on this book if you haven't read it, Sparked by a Medical Crisis. It's about so many things. And if any of you have ever had to spend time in a hospital bed or on bed rest, the places that your mind go are vast, and there can be a universe of thought that happens. And one of the things the book does that's really amazing and spectacular is capture the way in which time stops when you're in a situation like this. And one of the things that I wanted to ask Garth about was, I know that this also, you had a medical emergency. And I also hear a lot of the term autofiction, and I don't understand what it is. And I don't understand the difference between autofiction, nonfiction, and fiction. And I'm curious what you would say about that. I'm also curious why you chose fiction for this story rather than memoir. I'm just truly curious about that, so.
I also don't know what autofiction is. And it's actually, so this is a very triggering question. Thank you for beginning with it, because I think autofiction is a scam.
Yes,
I think
yes.
it really, I think it's a sloppy, basically meaningless term. And what I think it does, it takes what is the oldest game in literature, which is making literature out of experience, and takes these sort of technologies of representing inwardness and producing consciousness that were, in my account of it, invented by Saint Augustine, then developed through a kind of extraordinary mystical first-person writers who are central to the development of vernacular European literatures, was then further developed by the great tradition of the Renaissance essay in Montaigne and people like Thomas Browne, was then given a renovation in the late 19th century by the development of phenomenology, and then imported into the novel of consciousness before emerging in modernism in writers like Virginia Woolf and James Baldwin and Thomas Mann. And the idea that you could sort of take that tradition and brand it and pretend that Knausgaard invented it, and brand it, market it so that you can make money from it, and then so that you can call it a fad and dismiss it. You don't get to do that with this, centuries-long development. So I think it's just a meaningless term. I am a writer. I turn to art because there is something either in my direct experience or in my vicinity that bewilders me, and that defeats all of my other tools for thinking. And that's when I need the sort of peculiar pressures of art. And just because of, I don't know what, the tools that fit my hands are the tools of fiction. And in order to sort of think and in order to think as deeply as I can about the world, I need scene, and I need the pressures of form, and I need the possibility of invention. All of which, are crucial in my books. It feels to me like what I do to experience is pulverize it. To make oil paint, you crush up flaxseed and you get the oil, and then you suspend pigment into the oil. Well, I feel like I take lived experience and pulverize it and turn it into a medium and suspend invention in that medium. And so when people say to me, as they often do, how much of this is real, it feels to me like a category mistake. It feels to me like a surreal question, like you're going up to an oil painting and saying how much of this is flax. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's always been clear to me that I write fiction, not memoir, not nonfiction, just because those are the tools I use.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think autofiction is a scam also.
Absolutely a scam.
Yeah.
Like identity.
Well, because anytime I see a book designated that way, I'm like, wait, isn't this just fiction? Like, isn't this just, like we all, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not new to put your own lived experience into
Absolutely, it's
what you're doing.
Yeah.
Speaking of lived experience and speaking of fiction, I sent you this text. And if only I could text all of you, but I'll tell you what this text said. It said, well, I said, hey man, and I said, small rain unfolds like a slow opening flower. It's amazing how truly being in the body can suspend time, can feel like inhabiting one continuous present, agonizing or ecstatic, depending on the situation. And I'm curious how you think about this book in relationship to the first two. You are obviously a explorer of embodiment and are an incredible explorer and bringing back what you find to us. And I feel like, the first two books are very focused on the ecstatic experiences that can come through sex, the merging that can happen there. This is a very different bodily experience, and has to do with, agon, the agonization. And yet, there are also similarities in terms of the way both sexual ecstasy, physical pain can stop time, can require incredible attentiveness, can stop the chatter of the mind. And so how do you think about this book in relationship to your first two?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it does. I mean, I do think there are real continuities. Like, I think I've always been interested in the body in crisis. And sex is one kind of bodily crisis. And, extreme pain and illness is another kind of bodily crisis. On the other hand, there are lots of ways in which I think this book is distinct. For one thing, I mean, the first two books were clearly about adventure, about geographical adventure. The narrator is in Eastern Europe, also very much about sexual adventure. And in this book, the narrator finds himself, 7 years into a long-term relationship, living in the American heartland. Like, he shares a mortgage with his partner. In some ways, his life has become something that looks like the opposite of adventure. But in fact, I mean, what I hope is one of the long arcs of the book is that, at the beginning of the book, this pain, this sort of experience of annihilating pain, this illness, takes his life away from him. And in this paradoxical way, in taking his life away from him, it delivers his life back to him. Because when he's in this hospital bed, and he ends up spending 10 or 12 days in an ICU, and when he's in this hospital bed, totally isolated, what he longs for more than anything else is the sort of dailiness of his life in this little house in Iowa. Which is a dailiness that he had become, like, the wonder in that dailiness he had become dulled to, in a way that I think many of us become kind of dulled to our everyday lives. And I hope that one of the long arcs of the book is that he comes to see that dailiness and the experience of domesticity, the long day-by-day knowing of another person, that too is an adventure. And that, he realizes the extent to which he is attached to the adventure of this life he's been living.
I love that. That's beautiful. In relationship to that, I was wondering if you would read the potato chip. Because it's on page 263.
Thank you.
So the main character is finally coming through this experience. It can finally have solid food, is heading towards being able to come home. And is it the nurse or is it, no, it's G.
It's his sister.
His sister gives him a potato chip. And I mean, this is where the daily becomes transporting.
Yeah.
And it's also a poet's sensibility, which I'll talk about in a second, but I just love this so much.
Thank you for saying that. Sure, I'll read this section. This is from the end of the book. It's his last day in the hospital. He's about to leave the hospital, and his sister has shown up, and she's brought him food from the outside world. but it's all food that he knows he shouldn't eat, like potato chips. But, and so he says, he says it's something he shouldn't eat, but that would mean telling G she had brought the wrong things. I imagined her feeling hurt, and so I reached into the bag, taking just one chip. It was thin and almost weightless, an amazing object, really, if you think about it, a miracle of engineering, a kind of transubstantiation of a root vegetable, which I just want to say, some people have said that this book is humorless.
Oh my God, that is so funny.
That is so funny. There is no world in which the phrase transubstantiation of a root vegetable is not thank you. I feel seen. A kind of transubstantiation of a root vegetable, which is an absurd thing to think and also true. When I put the chip in my mouth, the pleasure was extraordinary, the taste of it, but also the feel as I crushed it with my tongue. Closing my eyes, I could almost see lights shooting off in the interior, fireworks. After so many days without anything like it, it was almost an orgasm. And it was entirely engineered. Nothing in nature was like this, so perfectly tuned to our pleasure. Whole teams of chemists had designed it. I knew it was pernicious, one of the manipulations of capitalism, a deformation of our natural response designed for addiction. It was the reason I was fat, the reason the whole country was fat. Really, it symbolized in miniature the utter decadence of all genuine value, the fall of a culture, absolute bliss.
I love this moment so much. First of all, it is hilarious, and I underline transubstantiation of a root vegetable.
So funny.
It really is. Did you laugh when you wrote it?
I laughed. I thought everyone will see that this is fun. I think all my books are funny, and I think there are like funny moments in all of my books. But I thought surely this moment no one will miss as being funny.
You mentioned Thomas Mann, and there's a way in which this book is very old-fashioned in the way it goes off on long. Tangent doesn't feel like the right word. The speaker is stuck in bed and the mind is rolling, but the mind goes so many places, and it just reminds me of moments in the Magic Mountain where, Hans Castorp has this crush on this Kyrgyz duchess or something, and he's so obsessed with her. Everybody has tuberculosis at this place, and he's so obsessed with her. He has a little X-ray of her lung in a locket.
That's right.
And he the pages of description of the inside of her body, like her veins and her, but I mean, just delivered with just like, I love her, but also like just the body, like just so these long travels. And did anybody say to you can't do this in this book? Did your editor, did anybody get upset with you? Did anybody say this is a disaster? Did anybody say that? I mean, I know this is book 3, and so maybe not. But when you start, because I know this also characterizes your writing, like, so what happened when you were starting out? Did people say, no, more plot, less thinking? Like, what happened?
Yeah, so, I mean, something that I believe very strongly and something that I tell my students all the time is that no serious art is made for everybody. Like there is, I think, a real danger built into the workshop model, which is that just like the fact of the model, especially if you don't discuss it, can delude you into thinking that what it means to succeed as an artist is to appeal to as many people around the table as possible. That is not how art works. Art is not democratic in that way. And I do think one of the best things about books as a technology is that they're so easy to close. And it does not trouble me that, yes, I mean, always, and not just in my prose, but also like back in my poetry days, people have felt like repulsed by my work and by the sensibility of my work. And I'm okay with that because all of the books that I love have that effect on some people. And certainly I think there is a lot of anxiety in contemporary North American fiction practice about being fast, like keeping the reader's interest. We use these words like hook. I actually am so not interested in that. All of that language about seizing the reader's interest, keeping the reader's attention, hooking the reader, that is all a language of coercion. And the art that I love best is respectful of our freedom, including our freedom to be indifferent to it. Like there's a moment in the book where the narrator thinks about Elizabeth Bishop and teaching Elizabeth Bishop and how easy it is to read an Elizabeth Bishop poem and miss the point. I think that is part of the greatness of Elizabeth Bishop's poems, that they kind of are sublimely indifferent to that coercive power that art can have. That's not what she's interested in. And, the thing is, certainly, like when you are submitting your first book or when you're looking for an agent, I say this to my students all the time too, it does not matter how many times people say no to you. It only matters that one person says yes. And when Mitzi Angel, who I have had the great good fortune of having Mitzi Angel as the editor of all three of my books, when she bought What Belongs to You, she said, one of the things I love about this book is that it doesn't feel like a debut novel to me. And I think part of what she was responding to is that, North American prose practice, with a few exceptions, probably most importantly James Baldwin, that has not set the points of my aesthetic compass. Like Latin American literature, Central European literature, and then above all poetry has been much and opera. Like these are the points of my aesthetic compass. And so I am interested in consciousness. I'm interested in trying to get on the page what being an embodied consciousness feels like. That is my project. That is not a project that interests everyone. That's fine.
Yeah. I just told Garth before we began that this is a poet's book. It really is. I'm a poet, and I thought this book is for me, just in terms of the weird things it does with time and attention. I don't wonder how do I want to do this. I'm curious about your background as a poet. I'm curious about the way you feel like your love of poetry and your experience as a poet comes into your fiction. And then I want you to read that little book that I put up on social media today because I loved it so much. And somebody wrote on my Facebook page, "Oh, I want to share this with my students." And I said, "I just sent this to my class."
Oh, thank you.
Because it's such a wonderful articulation of both the classroom experience, like bringing poetry, especially to undergrads, in my experience, but also just what poems are for. So I don't know how you want to address this question.
Well, thinking about things that are wrong. So I do think, like in each of my books, especially in What Belongs to You and in this book, I think there is like a choice that is obviously wrong. In my first book, the middle section is a 43-page long single paragraph. That, for many readers, was obviously wrong. And in this book, at the beginning of the 4th chapter, there's like a 6,000-word essay on basically a 40-word poem.
It's my favorite part of this book. Oh, yours too? Yes. Chapter 4, amazing.
So this is the thing, like, I am not a very confident maker of art. I second guess everything in my books except those wrong choices. Like, that is the one thing that I am sure is right about my first novel, and this is the one thing I'm sure is right about this novel, which is not to say that many readers will not dislike it. It's just that I know it's the right choice for the book. And the reason it's the right choice for the book, so this is a book about a guy who decades before he expected to have to confront questions of the meaning of his life, is forced to confront those questions. He's forced to ask himself, okay, if this is it at 42 or 43, because one of the first things he's told in the ER by a vascular surgeon is that he could die. And so he's confronted with this question of, okay, if this is it, what has it all been worth? What has it meant? And his has been a life devoted to art. And I think any life devoted to art is a gamble. Really, I think any life structured around a kind of central object of devotion is a gamble. Because in that sort of existential flash, that is not the abstract knowledge that one will, of course, like all organic beings, die, but that like death is there. I think you discover whether that object of devotion holds up or not. And so there are lots of meditations in this book about art. And the narrator has gambled that art objects really are, like human beings, repositories of a value that is infinite, that you can pour your life into a work of art, and that something will be poured back into you from that work of art. And at some point in writing the book, I realized that I needed to demonstrate that. I couldn't just say it. I needed to try to show what that looks like. And of course, you can't put infinity on the page. Like that's the whole dilemma of art making, that we are trying to make incommensurate things commensurate. Because consciousness is, or may as well be, infinite. Our experience of embodiedness, of existence, may as well be infinite in terms of just the amount of data, what consciousness is, you know, the taking in of data. You can't put that on the page. But maybe if you break the novel contract and put a 6,000 word essay in, maybe that feels a little bit like infinity. I suspect some readers experience that a little bit like infinity. It's a way for him to try to show what it means to read a poem with your whole life.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's here. And yeah, I'll read this. It's just a single paragraph. Oh, I see. Now I don't. Yeah, it's, yeah, I think this is the
Yeah,
paragraph.
183 that starts,
Oh, 183.
it starts, read slowly. Wait, maybe it's not.
No, I think it's 188. Here, read it again, maybe.
Yeah, read it
Yeah,
again.
okay.
Yeah,
Read this paragraph.
yeah, yeah. 188.
So this comes towards the end of this essay on poetry. Oh, but first, actually, I want to read you the author, which is very short. It's called Stranger's Child. So far as I know, no one has discussed this poem.
This was the first time really known it.
Yeah, no one, like I've looked at every book on Oppen I can find, and no one has talked about this poem. It's a great poem. I was happy that no one had talked about it. I wanted sort of an open field, but Stranger's Child. Sparrow in the cobbled street, little sparrow round and sweet, Chaucer's bird. Or if a leaf sparkle among leaves, among the season's leaves, the sparrow's feet, feet of the sparrow's child touch naked rock.
Just before you go on, when I read that poem, like I'm hearing all of those E sounds, and then when you get to naked rock, it's sonically startling. And I kept waiting for the narrator to say something about that moment. I just want to tell you in terms of Garth's capacity for delayed gratification. It doesn't come until the very end of the chapter, and it's so wonderful and beautiful and real and completely merges with this situation that the narrator is in the hospital. It's just one of those wonderful, wonderful. I just was like, this is brilliant. This is art. This is, and you're. I know people say Garth is a great stylist. You are a great stylist.
Oh.
Okay, let's hear.
I mean, I'm glad you feel that, because what I hope happens in this fourth chapter is that you have this long essay, which really is an essay. I mean, it's stitched into the narrative, you know, but basic, you could almost take it out and like, it's just like a pretty academic essay. But then at the end of the chapter, the narrator undergoes what is kind of weirdly along with the initial pain, it's sort of his most harrowing experience in the hospital. And I see that as a scenic recapitulation of the essay, because if the essay is asking, can art help us live? In that scenic recapitulation, the answer is no, except. And in the except, in the way that this poem comes back, in that except is like all of salvation for this narrator. But I'll read this little paragraph. Read it again, I would tell my students. Read it more slowly. When they looked up baffled by a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, maybe, whom I loved, baffled not because anything was difficult or unclear, but because nothing seemed to happen, because they almost always thought and sometimes said, what was the point? Read it again. Read it more slowly. That was the whole of my pedagogy when I taught my students, who were pressured everywhere else to be more efficient, to take in information more quickly, to make each moment count, to instrumentalize time, which is a terrible way to live. Dehumanizing, it disfigures existence. But it was difficult to defend the alternative, to justify it in terms of outcomes and deliverables, costs and benefits. It was indefensible by that logic. Its value lay in demonstrating the possibility of other logics, other relationships to value, I mean other ways to live. The point was to perceive reality, I wanted to tell them, to see things that are only visible at a different speed, a different pitch of attention. The value of poems is tuning us to a different frequency of existence. But that knowledge is experiential. You can't explain it or demonstrate it or guarantee it. You can only try to tempt students toward it, entice them. And that had become harder and harder over the years when I taught high school, which were the years when everyone got smartphones. When I started, they were novelties, prestige items, and when I finished, they were ubiquitous. It had become more difficult for me, too, to find my way back to poems, to the mind space of poems. I'm on my phone as much as anybody else, scrolling and liking, atomizing my attention. Probably I wouldn't have seen Oppin's poem in this way anywhere other than that bed, staring at the poem as I might stare at a painting, which if you do long enough, you make discoveries. The painting opens up, you tune yourself to its frequency. I had never experienced the end of Oppin's poem so powerfully, had never felt so starkly the finality of it, the way the world is stripped bare, how the cobbled street, which is a made thing, shaped, familiar, welcoming of human life, human comfort, becomes naked rock. It's a different scale of time, too. Everything else in the poem is transient. The sparrow, the leaves, even a cobbled street is transient, of the order of created things, a style. But naked rock is uncreated. Uncreated by us, I mean, I'm not being theological. It invokes a scale of time that, so far as we're concerned, might as well be eternity. The naked rock, the sparrow's foot. It made me think of one of L's poems, one of my favorites. L is his partner, who's a poet from Spain. The speaker is in the mountains, watching sunlight on cliffs. And I should say, in my first two books, talking about them, I've been very severe about a kind of absolute firewall between the book and my life. Unfortunately, this poem was written by my partner, Luis Munoz. And so it's a violation of that firewall made between the book and my life, but this is one of Luis's poems. The speaker is in the mountains, watching sunlight on cliffs, and he makes a kind of account, considering how much time what he sees will last in relation to him. Las rocas, mucho más, he says, los castaños, bastante, los juncos, las avispas, mucho menos. That's how the poem ends. No plea to sentiment, just dispassionate observation, mucho más, mucho menos. What more is there to say? Oppin doesn't plead for sentiment either. It isn't pathos exactly or obviously, but there's something irremediable there. In that naked rock the child has to stand on. In this poem he sent to the daughter he loved. And there was something weirdly that comforted me that time in the bed, when I was unable to get up to walk around the ward or even move to the chair. The irremediability of it was a comfort. that he had seen it and faced up to it, and in facing up to it, made this poem. Beautiful. Thank you.
We're gonna turn towards getting some questions from the audience, but is there something nobody has asked you or that you've always wanted to say about this book that you haven't gotten a chance to say before we do that?
You know, someone else just asked me this question yesterday. Always when I'm asked this question, I draw a blank because I don't formulate questions about my own book. You know, it's funny, but I don't. It's so, you know, there's a way in which, like, as in that essay on the Oppen poem, and also, you know, I have this silly Substack where I write a lot about art and poetry. And when I do that, and also in my more formal essays, like, I really try to, like, analyze, like, neurotically. Like, I am a believer in neurotic close reading. I think that that is actually where aesthetic education happens. In sort of reading so intensely, you try to enter into the choices behind a text and tell a story about those choices and tell a story about, you know, not what was the writer consciously thinking, but instead, why did something feel right? When I'm right, and I do think, you know, that's like training your muscles in a way. And so you hope that there's a kind of muscle memory that takes over when you're actually writing. I actually want to protect my work from the application of my own intelligence to it in that way. Like, there's a way in which, you know, I think once you've done that sort of work of muscle memory, you know, of sort of building up certain movements. I mean, I do think of it as like playing scales, you know, I mean, then I think, to me, art is about trying to pay attention to urges that you don't understand, and like trying to really inhabit, you know, I mean, this phrase negative capability, I mean, I do think there is something apophatic in art making, that like you have to, part of the sort of, I mean, I do think it's a kind of courage required in making art, is allowing yourself to be moved by urges you don't understand and urges whose end you can't see. So I don't formulate questions about my work.
Okay then. Good.
But I hope you have some.
Yeah. Would anybody like to ask a question? And I can hand you this mic. I can hand you this mic. Or Shane can hand you this mic.
Oh.
I brought-
And you
I
get to
got
have a
some new
mic
ones.
in the Saturdays dying. That's great.
Oh.
No questions.
Okay.
It's the first one's always on.
I bet it's a dandy question.
I've heard I've heard Louise Erdrich describe her work as like her favorite books to write.
She's one of my favorite writers.
Yes, as like one long novel. And having read now 3 of yours and seeing so many differences and similarities, do you think of your work that way? Like, how do you see them in connection to one another?
Yeah.
This is what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to take a moment, so Louise Erdrich, you know, it's hard to say that Louise Erdrich is underappreciated because she's won the Pulitzer, she's won the National Book, like she's won every prize you can, and yet I think she's underappreciated because I don't see people talking about her as like our equivalent to Zola. Like, I mean, she is writing this extraordinary sequence of novels that is like Zola. I mean, there's this crazy ambition behind it to sort of document an entire world. Like, she's a great novelist on a scale that I don't think has been acknowledged. I love her. It makes a lot of sense that she talks about her books as like one unfolding project in a very different way. I mean, I am attracted to writers whose books are like individually well-made autonomous things. Like, you can read Small Rain without having read the first 2 books. You can read any of my books without having read the others. And I don't think of cleanness and what belongs to you. The relationship between them is not that of sequel or prequel. Instead, I think of them as like intermingling. And there is a way that I want each book to be a sort of well-wrought, independent, autonomous thing, and also to feel like an opening up of a kind of ongoing project. I don't know if this is what I'm going to want to do in 10 years, but for now, I like that feeling. And there are moments, like in this book, I mean, Cleanness and What Belongs to You like really do intermingle. They overlap in time. They're set in the same place. They have characters that sort of drift between the books. This book is separate in time and in geography, but there are crucial moments where it touches, especially with What Belongs to You, which What Belongs to You, there's a lot of medical stuff in What Belongs to You too. And What Belongs to You, which is a love story, the love object, Mitko, becomes very ill. And at the end of that book, there's now an operatic adaptation of What Belongs to You, which is like one of the most joyful things to ever happen to me. And just last week, I saw the stage premiere, and the way the composer has written this moment, I just really felt like I was just unmade. I feel that way every time I hear how he has set this moment, where Miko tells the narrator that he's been told he's going to die. And the narrator uses language where he says he realizes that there is this impassable gulf between him and Mitko, that this relationship that has been structured by differences of various kinds, that this is a difference of a radically different order between the well and the seriously ill, and that Mitko is on the other side of this gulf alone. And the narrator, not only can he not cross this gulf, but he doesn't want to cross the gulf. He doesn't want to stand beside Mitko and face what he's facing. And that's sort of a devastating realization of his own moral limitations. Well, in this book, I repeat that language when the narrator has the experience, the kind of nadir of his experience in the hospital, of feeling utterly isolated and feeling this rage at everyone who is not beside him on this. And I hope that readers who know What Belongs to You, well, and now all of you will know that, whether you've read the book or not, that those moments touch. And that's really important to me. And I think if you have read What Belongs to You, I mean, again, it's not that you need to read What Belongs to You to read Small Rain, but I think that moment lights up a little bit if you've read it. So, yeah, thank you. You are so beautiful. I love you. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I have two questions. One's kind of like a more serious, one's like a more fun one. But so you mentioned about how the one choice that always feels right when you're working on your novels is like the wrong choice, and how you draw a lot of inspiration from Central American authors. And those are some of my favorites. Like I'm probably gonna pronounce their names wrong, but I think like Samantha Schweblin and then Mariana Enriquez too. Yeah, and then so I'm looking for Rex if you have more Central American authors, and I'm gonna get my notes out, and then you can just like I'll write them down, and then just talking more about like what other wrong choices you sort of notice in other works that you maybe come across. Obviously, you can't decide as a not you didn't write the books, but just what would be the sort of conventional wrong choice, but why did it feel so right in your eyes? And then the second one, that's more fun one, is as someone who used to live in Iowa City for 4 years, and is the bar that the neighbor talks about where they meet Elle. Was that Deadwood, or inspired by Deadwood, or
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay, my must.
Clinton Social Club.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Which no longer exists.
Okay, yeah.
So inspiration.
Okay.
Ah,
It kind of because we talk about next to the sports bar and like more low key and like.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I love the Iowa City knowledge.
And like the talking about the hill, it was kind of trippy. Like the talking about where the frat houses end and the houses begin. I'm like, oh my god, it was. But yeah.
Yeah, in all my books, like place. So my books are full of invention, but place I cannot invent. Like I don't know. It's like a moral thing for me. And it was really problematic when I was writing Cleanness, because, you know, I worked on cleanness in the States. You know, I wrote most of cleanness after I moved back to the States. And I found that like I would get blocked in a chapter because like I couldn't remember what a street corner smelled like at 2 a.m. And I would be like, this is ridiculous. Like just put somebody there roasting nuts or something. Like I couldn't do it. And so, you know, I went back every year that I was working on the book. I spent 1 to 2 months in Sofia. And I would literally, like, I would just fill up notebooks with sense data. Like anywhere I thought I would write about, I would just take down all of this sense data. And as same is true with Iowa City. Like I hope if anything about Iowa City in the book is wrong, it's a mistake. Like, it was not intended. So South American, Central American, Latin American writers. I am obsessed with a group of writers who are sort of loosely talked about as the Latin American queer Baroque, who I think are radically underknown in North America, in the English-speaking world. The most important for me is a writer named Pedro Lemebel, Lemebel. His novel, so he now has 2 books. He died a few years ago, several years ago now. And when he died, I wrote a piece about him in the New Yorker, so you can find that and get sort of a sense of who he is. But he has 2 books available in English. His great novel, which is called My Tender Matador, Tengo Miedo Torero in Spanish, My Tender Matador in English, which is for me, like it's one of my top 10 favorite novels of all time. And then just published is a collection of his chronicas, which is actually like his great work were these chronicas, these short pieces he wrote for newspapers and for the radio that are, I just think, one of the astonishments of world literature. And there's a new volume from Penguin Classics called The Last Supper of the Queer Apostles. And that collects a number of his chronicas. And if you haven't read him, there is, and you would like a short piece to start with, there's a piece called, I actually don't know what the new translation, how the new translation translates it, but it's probably something like The Last Kiss of Loba Lamar, which is an astonishing story about a group of friends, a group of drag queens, or there's no good word, a group of locas, there's no good word for this in English, but gender non-conforming gay men, something like that, ish. Taking care of someone dying of AIDS. And I think it's just one of the profound stories I know about AIDS, about community, about care. It's just great. But that whole group of writers, the most famous member of that group in the United States is probably Reinaldo Arenas, the Cuban writer who wrote a book called Before Night Falls that was turned into a film. He also has his greater accomplishment is a group of 5 novels that he collectively called The Secret Life of Cuba, or The Secret History of Cuba. They're all available in English from Grove Press. They are astonishing, so sexy, so wild. And then also people like Severo Serdui. I mean, there's a whole world of these writers that are unknown in English. And then your really interesting question about the wrong choice. So I had a composition teacher when I was a music student very early on who talked about the right wrong note. And that like made such a deep impression on me. But it's funny now that you put me on the spot to say like point to that in other writers, I'm not sure I can, except maybe Frank Bedard. So Frank Bedard, who for my money is the greatest living American writer, the most important living American writer, was also my most important teacher. And when I was a graduate student, like Frank and I exchanged poem drafts, which was an amazing experience for me. Frank's great teacher was Robert Lowell, and Frank tells a story about, and Frank talks about how important it was that Robert Lowell listened to him when he talked about Lowell's drafts. And he says the first time that Lowell changed something, Frank said it was like seeing a statue in a museum move its arm. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's great.
And it was so important to him as a young poet to sort of have that. And Frank had a similar, I mean, I'm not comparing me to either of those writers in stature, but he had a similar effect on me in terms of sharing his work. And there is a poem, it's a beautiful poem by Frank, the title of which I have always hated. And I remember we like fought, I mean, not fought, but like, it was like, Frank, this is a terrible title. And the title is, so it's a poem about being in love with a straight guy and how one time the straight guy let the speaker of the poem see his dick. And he like lit a cigarette. And in the light of that, he showed this guy, like what this guy desperately wanted to see. And in the same moment, gave him this and also forbade it to him. It's an incredible poem. And the title of it is Phenomenology of the Prick. I mean, and so Frank and I talked about this. And Frank said, and this was so important to me, Frank said, when I put that, he said, I can't argue for that title. But when I put that title on top of the poem, I feel like the poem is a neon sign, and it gets plugged in. And like that feeling is what is important. Arguments don't matter. I can argue myself into and out of everything. Like I can argue that the worst possible thing I've ever written is brilliant. I can argue that the best thing I've done is terrible. You know, I can make any argument about anything going either way. It's that feeling. You know, Yeats said he knew a poem was finished because a poem finished with a sensation like that of a box clicking shut. For Frank, it's a neon sign being plugged in. Like you have to learn to feel that and to trust that. And no matter how wrong, like even if objectively wrong, like a 43-page paragraph, a lot of readers are just going to throw that across the room. But we are being surveilled all the time. But it doesn't matter how objectively wrong it is, it's right. You know, if it gives you that feeling, it's right. And the fact that Frank was so steadfast about that, that was such an important lesson.
We could take another question, or you could read a passage, or we should probably move towards the
The
signing.
signing part.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does someone have one more question?
Virtual audience as well, if you have a question. We've been very chatty there, but.
Oh.
Oh, yay!
Hi.
Hi, it's so good to see you. Speaking of opera friends.
Hi. So what the narrator is going through is a very stressful time.
Yeah.
And he takes a big part to focus on something else very stressful, which is what's going on with his home. And as a homeowner, I could really relate. And what I liked about that was, whereas your first two books were very like adventureful, this felt like a grounded adventure.
Yeah.
And like you kind of just had to go with the flow when things went wrong. And I'm not trying to give away too much of like the plot, but there was a lot going on with like what happened with the narrator's health that I saw some like mimicking of what was happening to the house.
Yes.
And I thought that was beautiful.
Oh.
And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that or not.
Well, thank you for that. So yeah, I mean, one way that I think about the thematic structure of the book is as like nesting dolls of brokenness. Because, you know, the narrator's in this body that is broken, which is in a house that is broken, which is in a country that is broken. And the fact that the narrator is a new homeowner, and the fact that home ownership has been an utter disaster. He and his partner discover too late that their house is falling down and like requires all of these repairs that they can't afford. You know, home ownership is really important in the book because it makes the narrator think about like neighborliness and what it means to live in a place. You know, he lives in a little blue dot of a town in a very deep red state. And he knows that he has neighbors who are, who hold views that he finds repugnant, but they're still his neighbors. And because it's an election year, because of increasing violence in the US, because of the pressures of COVID, which put more pressure on those fractures, he thinks a lot about like, what is the minimal condition of civilization? Like what allows us to live side by side with people and not kill each other? And this question of, forms of life that I think he has been very disdainful of. Like this is a guy who grew up a queer kid in the South. Like he understands all of the darkness that can lie beneath things like Southern gentility, Southern politeness. And I think he's very skeptical of Midwestern nice. But he comes to also feel that those forms of life of which he's been disdainful are precious, because they like being able to talk about the weather, being able to throw your neighbor's dog a ball, like that these are moments that allow us to have face-to-face encounters with each other that are precious because they sustain a life that allows us not to kill one another. And there's a way in which, I think he has also, like, there's a way in which in all of those nesting dolls, brokenness makes something available to care. So he has come to hate this house. This house has been a disaster. It has been a source of panic. And yet when a further disaster happens and a tree falls on this house, that brokenness makes the house available to him as an object of care, as an object of love. In the same way, I think he has been, like a lot of sort of left-leaning Americans, neglectful of the love that is demanded by any common project of social life, by any project of nationhood, and seeing how fragile that project is makes him realize how precious it is, and how precious these dumb forms of life, like hell of a storm, how precious these dumb forms of life that allow us to live side by side are. And then also his body, which he has spent his entire life hating. The hardest thing I've ever written is a passage in this book where he's being bathed by his nurse, and he just looks at his body and sees his body. And I mean, this body that has caused him so much shame and humiliation, and yet he sees it and it's like, patches of hair are missing, there's traces of adhesive, he's covered in bruises because every 8 hours he gets a heparin shot. And his response to that, kind of instinctive response, is to say, poor body. And he realizes that there is an entirely different relationship to his body he might have had in recognizing in its brokenness that this body is available to care. And so that relationship, and again, it's about a relationship between like negation and affirmation, which is like what the whole book is about, in some sense, the grand negation of death, how that makes possible a kind of commitment to his life that he hasn't felt before, and how the negation of woundedness or brokenness makes possible a kind of attachment to these three things: body, house, nation, that he realizes all of them are necessary for a life he cares about. Thank you all so much for being here. Oh, no.
We're done. I would like to say that we do have copies of Louisa's new book, My Threat, but they are somewhere between her house and St. Louis. If you want to order a signed copy, it still has to be somewhere. Thank you so much for this incredible evening. Thank you all for attending tonight. We are going to do the signing out here close to the desk. If you have not already purchased a copy of the book and would like to, Amber and Evan are at the desk and would love to sell you a copy. And thank you all. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Oh, and Dana's books are also available.
Yes.
Yes. Who doesn't?
Everybody wants Paul.
That was the wrong right thing to say.
That's right.
Wonderful.
I love it. I was so excited. I love it.
Yay!
We wanted to
Have you guys
come
well,
out.
no.
I have to go say hello.
Come out to my town. I think it's 1 o'clock.
It's good to see you.
Of course.